gunshot shattered the golden afternoon like a thunderclap, sending birds scattering from the oak trees lining the pristine sidewalks of Oak Ridge Estates. Emily Carter's scream followed an instant later, raw and piercing, a sound torn from the depths of her soul. Rex lay sprawled on the pavement, his silver and black coat darkening with blood. His powerful body convulsed once, then stilled. Emily dropped to her knees, hands trembling as she pressed against the wound, as if sheer willpower could stop the life from slipping away. "No! Please, Rex, stay with me!" Her voice cracked, tears streaming down her face. Officer Miller stood a few feet away, his service pistol still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. His face was impassive, as if he had just completed a routine task. The dog was aggressive, he stated flatly, holstering his weapon. Beside him, Officer Calloway exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "Let's move the girl." They hadn't noticed the elderly woman across the street, watching from her porch with sharp, knowing eyes. Helen Whitmore's arthritic fingers clenched around her phone as she dialed a number that would reach halfway across the world. A number that belonged to Daniel Carter. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Emily had never felt so cold, despite the Texas heat pressing down on her like an unforgiving hand. The world around her blurred. Voices became distant murmurs, but the sight of Rex, motionless, gone, was burned into her mind. "Miss, step away from the animal." Calloway's voice broke through her daze as he reached for her arm. She flinched away. "You killed him! He wasn't attacking. He was protecting me. Let's go, kid. You're coming with us." Miller's grip was firm, indifferent. Emily barely registered the murmurs around her. Neighbors had stepped out of their homes, drawn by the commotion. Some held their phones up, recording, but none stepped forward. "This isn't right," a voice finally rang out. Mrs. Whitmore had left her porch, her frail frame shaking with indignation. "You shot that girl's dog in cold blood. I saw everything." Miller's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, I suggest you return to your home. And I suggest you remember that this isn't 1950, she snapped, voice strong despite her age. "I'm calling her father. You know who he is, don't you?" Calloway exchanged a glance with Miller. A flicker of unease passed between them. "We're just doing our job. The dog wasn't a threat," Mrs. Whitmore cut in. "I have it all on video, and believe me, gentlemen, you'll regret this." Miller's lip curled, but he turned back to Emily. "We need to take you to the station. Standard procedure." Emily's fists clenched. Her father had told her to always remain calm, even in the worst situations, but right now all she felt was fury. "You think you're untouchable," she whispered. "You're wrong." She didn't resist as they led her toward the cruiser. The officers didn't notice Mrs. Whitmore's shaking hands as she sent the video to someone who could make them answer for what they had done. Miles away, in a classified location, a phone buzzed. A soldier glanced at the screen, eyes narrowing at the name displayed. Daniel Carter picked up. A moment later, he was already moving. The military base hummed with efficiency, soldiers moving with purpose under the burning sun. Inside a steel-gray command center, Daniel Carter stood in full tactical gear, scanning a topographical map of an enemy stronghold. The mission briefing continued around him, but his focus was elsewhere. The weight of duty, of responsibility, pressed on his shoulders, but nothing compared to the weight of fatherhood. Then his phone buzzed. An encrypted message flashed in the secure screen, Emergency. Emily, call now. A cold dread settled in his chest. His heartbeat remained steady. Years of training ensured that. But something deeper twisted inside him. Without a word, he stepped out of the briefing room and into the communications hub. A single nod to the technician secured him a private line. "Jasmine," he said the moment the call connected. His sister's voice was tight. "Daniel, you need to come home, now." What happened? He was already moving toward his quarters, already making calculations in his mind. Deployment schedules, travel logistics, emergency extraction protocols. None of them mattered. Only Emily. "It's bad, Daniel." Jasmine took a breath. Emily was out walking Rex. 2 officers stopped her. They shot him. Right in front of her. For a brief moment the world around him blurred. He stopped walking. "What?" His voice was low, dangerous. "They said he was aggressive, but Daniel... There are witnesses, video footage. This wasn't a mistake." He closed his eyes, inhaling sharply through his nose. Images of Emily flashed through his mind, her bright smile, her infectious laughter, the way she held on to Rex as if he were her anchor to the world. And now she had watched him die. "Where is she now?" he asked, voice controlled but filled with steel. "At the station. They took her in." Jasmine's fury was barely contained. "They wouldn't let me see her at first, but I'm on my way." Daniel was already stripping off his gear, replacing it with civilian clothing. "I'll be home in 12 hours, maybe less." "Daniel, listen to me." Jasmine's voice softened, but the urgency remained. "They don't know who they've messed with. But you do. Be smart. Be careful. Emily needs you more than they need to be punished." Daniel exhaled slowly. "I understand. I won't lose control." But even as he said it, the rage inside him coiled tighter. He ended the call and turned to the nearest officer. "I need immediate clearance for emergency leave." The soldier hesitated. "Sir, we're about to deploy now." Daniel's tone brooked no argument. Within minutes, he was on a military transport plane, heading home, heading to Emily, and heading straight into war. The plane roared through the night sky, its engines a dull hum in Daniel's ears. He sat rigid in his seat, muscles tense, his mind running through every possible scenario. He needed to prepare. He needed to act fast. As the city lights of Austin came into view, one thought burned in his mind. Whoever had hurt his daughter would soon understand the meaning of true fear. The city lights of Austin flickered below as Daniel Carter's plane touched down on the tarmac. He had barely waited for the seatbelt sign to turn off before standing, his movements precise, controlled, yet every muscle in his body was coiled with tension. By the time he stepped out of the terminal, a sleek black SUV was already waiting at the curb. The driver, a lean man in his early 40s, with a sharp gaze, gave a single nod as Daniel slid into the passenger seat. "Jasmine filled me in," the man said as he pulled into traffic. "It's bad, isn't it?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "How bad?" The man, Nathan Briggs, an old friend and former intelligence officer, handed Daniel a tablet. A paused video was displayed on the screen. Daniel tapped play. The grainy footage, taken from a phone across the street, showed Emily standing on the sidewalk, Rex at her side. The officers approached, their stances aggressive. There was no provocation, no warning, just the single shot that tore Rex away from her. The sound of Emily's scream sent ice through Daniel's veins. He forced himself to watch it again, and again. Finally, he set the tablet down, his fingers pressing into his temples. "Where is she?" Jasmine got her out of the station an hour ago, Briggs said. She's at home, shaken up, but physically okay. Daniel exhaled slowly. And the officers? Still on duty. The department's calling it unfortunate but justified. No internal review, no consequences. Business as usual. Daniel's grip tightened on the tablet. Not for long. Briggs studied him. You're not the same guy you were 10 years ago, Daniel. Don't let this take you back there. Daniel didn't respond. Instead, he turned to the window, watching as the city blurred past. He'd spent years in war zones, dismantling corruption, hunting down threats to national security. But this was personal, and he would handle it as such. The SUV pulled onto his street, headlights cutting through the darkness. The house stood just as he had left it, warm, familiar, but now tainted by what had happened. As soon as the vehicle stopped, Daniel was out, striding toward the door. It opened before he could knock. Jasmine stood there, her expression tight. She's been waiting for you. Daniel stepped inside, his gaze immediately searching the room, and then he saw her. Emily sat curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her small frame barely moving. But when she lifted her head and met his eyes, something inside him broke. There were no tears, no sobs, just silent devastation. He knelt beside her, voice softer than he thought possible. I'm here, baby girl. Emily hesitated for only a moment before throwing herself into his arms, gripping his shirt like a lifeline. Daniel closed his eyes. He had always been her protector. And now, he would be her vengeance. Emily had barely spoken since they left the station. Even now, as Daniel held her, she remained silent, her small fingers tightening around the fabric of his jacket as if she were afraid he might disappear too. He could feel her shallow breathing against his chest, her body stiff with unspoken fear. Jasmine sat down across from them, her face lined with exhaustion. She's been in shock, Daniel. It's worse than I've ever seen. Daniel pulled back just enough to look Emily in the eyes. Hey, he whispered, can you tell me what happened? Emily's throat worked, but no words came. Her lips trembled, and she simply shook her head. Daniel swallowed the anger that threatened to rise. This wasn't about him. It was about her. It's okay, he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You don't have to talk right now. But I need you to know something. I'm going to fix this. Emily looked up at him, something flickering in her hollow eyes. How? Daniel's jaw tightened. By making sure they never hurt anyone else again. Jasmine leaned forward, lowering her voice. I know what you're thinking, Daniel, but we have to be smart. We do this the right way. The right way doesn't always work, he muttered. No, but it's the only way to keep you from becoming what they think you are. Jasmine's gaze bore into his. We have evidence. We have witnesses. We build a case, we expose them, and we make them pay where it hurts the most. Daniel exhaled slowly, glancing at Emily. He wanted blood. He wanted justice. But most of all, he wanted his daughter to feel safe again. All right, he said at last. We build a case, but if that doesn't work... Jasmine sighed, rubbing her temples. Then we'll figure something out. Daniel turned back to Emily, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Try to get some rest, baby girl. I'm here now. She nodded against his chest, but Daniel knew sleep wouldn't come easy for either of them tonight. As he held her, his mind was already working, already planning. Tomorrow he would start hunting. Daniel sat in the dim glow of his home office, the weight of the last few hours pressing against his chest like a vice. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning, but his mind was anything but still. His laptop screen flickered as he sifted through files, pulling up every piece of information he could find on Officers Miller and Calloway. Criminal complaints, internal reviews, reports of excessive force. Each file was a testament to a system designed to protect its own. Both officers had numerous complaints against them, allegations of intimidation, unwarranted stops, even excessive violence. But not a single charge had stuck. Every case had been dismissed, every witness either recanted or mysteriously disappeared from records. Daniel clenched his jaw. This wasn't just a case of two bad cops. This was a pattern. A network of protection that kept men like Miller and Calloway on the streets, unchecked and untouchable. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Jasmine stepped inside, her face unreadable. Couldn't sleep either. He shook his head, gesturing for her to sit. She crossed the room, sinking into the chair across from him. I went through the police reports again, she said, sliding a file onto his desk. It's worse than we thought. They didn't just stop Emily by chance. They were looking for her. Daniel's blood ran cold. Explain. Jasmine pointed to a line in the report. The call that dispatched them to the neighborhood? It wasn't random. Someone filed an anonymous complaint about a suspicious individual walking an aggressive dog. Except guess what? No official record of who made the call. No recorded dispatch logs. It's like it appeared out of nowhere. Daniel exhaled through his nose, his hands forming tight fists. They set her up. I think so. And given their history, I don't think Emily was their first target. His stomach twisted. He had spent years dismantling operations like this overseas, corrupt systems designed to exploit and oppress, but he never imagined he'd be fighting the same kind of war in his own backyard. Then we find out who's behind it, he said, voice dangerously calm. We get evidence. We expose them. Jasmine nodded, but her expression remained wary. Just be careful, Daniel. This isn't a battlefield. You can't just... I know what I'm doing, he cut in, his voice firm, and I'm not letting this go. Jasmine sighed, rubbing her temples. All right, we'll start by pulling surveillance footage from the area. If they were targeting Emily, they've done this before. There has to be a pattern. Daniel nodded. He had spent his life hunting men in the shadows, dismantling threats before they could strike. This time the enemy was closer than ever, and he was going to bring them down. By morning, Daniel had barely slept. He sat in the kitchen with a steaming cup of coffee, his gaze fixed on the early morning news playing on the muted television. The story of Rex's shooting had begun making its way into small media outlets, though the official police statement framed it as an unfortunate incident involving an aggressive animal. No mention of Emily, no mention of the anonymous call. Jasmine entered the kitchen, phone in hand. I got something. Daniel looked up sharply as she slid her phone across the counter. A video was paused on the screen, security footage from a gas station near the scene of the shooting. Look here, she said, pressing play. The timestamp showed 10 minutes before the officer stopped Emily, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled into the lot. A man in civilian clothes stepped out and made a phone call. Jasmine zoomed in on the footage. Guess who? Officer Calloway. Daniel's eyes darkened. So, he placed the anonymous call himself. She nodded. And he wasn't alone. Look at the passenger seat. Daniel leaned in. A second figure was visible, though the face was mostly obscured by shadow. But there was something familiar about the posture, the build, I need a better angle, Daniel murmured. Jasmine smirked. Already ahead of you. I contacted a tech friend of mine. He's enhancing the footage now. We should have a clear image in a few hours. Daniel nodded, appreciation flashing in his eyes. Good work. Jasmine crossed her arms. So, what's your next move? Daniel took a sip of his coffee, his expression unreadable. I'm going to pay Calloway a visit. Jasmine's brow furrowed. Daniel, relax. I just want to talk. His voice was smooth, almost casual. But there was an edge beneath it, sharp and unmistakable. Jasmine exhaled. Just don't do anything stupid. Daniel set his mug down and stood. Stupid would be letting this slide. Without another word, he grabbed his keys and walked out the door. It was time to send a message. The late morning sun cast long shadows over the Austin Police Department as Daniel pulled into a visitor's parking space. The building was a fortress of bureaucracy, its glass doors and beige concrete facade a poor attempt at masking the corruption within. Daniel stepped out of his car, his movements measured, controlled. Every part of him screamed for action, but years of discipline had taught him patience. He wasn't here to start a war. Not yet. He was here to gather intelligence, to see just how deep this rot went. As he entered the station, the air was thick with the sterile scent of coffee and cheap disinfectant. Officers bustled about, some focused on paperwork, others chatting near the break room. None of them paid him much attention. Just another civilian coming in with a complaint. That was exactly how he wanted it. He approached the front desk where a bored-looking officer barely glanced up from his computer. Help you? Daniel slid a folded piece of paper across the counter. I need to speak with Officer Calloway. Urgent matter. The officer unfolded the paper and frowned. Inside was a printed still from the gas station footage. Calloway standing by the SUV, phone in hand. The officer hesitated. And you are? Daniel held his gaze. Someone he'll want to talk to. There was something in his tone, something that made the officer straighten slightly before picking up the phone. After a short, hushed conversation, he hung up and gestured toward a hallway. Interview room 3. Wait there. Daniel nodded once and walked down the hall, his senses alert, cameras in the corners, a locked side door leading to the restricted areas. Everything about this place was designed to keep civilians contained and officers protected. He stepped into the room and sat, hands folded on the metal table. He had barely settled when the door swung open. Calloway entered, his uniform crisp, his smirk even sharper. Mr. Carter, he drawled, shutting the door behind him. Didn't expect to see you so soon. Daniel didn't move. I'm sure you didn't. Calloway pulled out the chair opposite him, sitting with exaggerated ease. What can I do for you? Filing a complaint? Maybe looking for an apology? Daniel slid the photo across the table. You placed that call. The one that got my daughter detained. Calloway barely glanced at it. Don't know what you're talking about. Daniel tilted his head slightly. You sure about that? Because I have the enhanced footage coming in soon. Won't be long before we get a perfect view of your friend in the passenger seat. For the briefest moment, something flickered in Calloway's eyes. Not fear, annoyance. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the table. You think you're onto something, don't you? Daniel met his gaze, unflinching. I don't think. I know. And you're going to tell me who else is involved. Calloway let out a slow breath, his smirk never quite fading. You've been out of the game too long, Carter. You think threats work on men like me? Daniel didn't blink. This isn't a threat. It's a warning. You tell me what I want to know, or I'll pull every string I have until your entire world collapses around you. Calloway chuckled, shaking his head. You really think you're that powerful? You're just one man. And let me tell you something. This city doesn't run on justice. It runs on control. The people who actually make the decisions. You'll never even see them coming. Daniel sat forward, his voice dropping to something cold and sharp. I don't need to see them. I just need to find one weak link in the chain. And I'm looking right at him. Calloway's smirk faltered, just for a second. Before he could respond, the door opened. Another officer, this one higher ranked, stepped inside. Calloway, step outside, now. Calloway hesitated, but then pushed up from his chair. He leaned in close, voice barely above a whisper. You keep pushing, Carter, and you're going to wish you stayed in whatever war zone you crawled out of. Daniel held his stare, unmoving, as Calloway exited. The door shut, leaving him alone with his thoughts. A moment later, his phone buzzed. Jasmine's voice came through the line. We got it, the enhanced image. You need to see this. Daniel rose from his chair, a dangerous calm settling over him. I'm on my way. War had just been declared. The drive back to Jasmine's house was silent, but Daniel's mind was anything but. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, his jaw clenched as he replayed every word of his conversation with Calloway. The officer had been cocky, too cocky. He wasn't just a dirty cop covering his own tracks. He was part of something larger, something confident enough to believe it couldn't be touched. That meant there were more of them. And it meant Daniel wasn't just going after two officers anymore. He was about to take on an entire system. As he pulled into the driveway, he saw Jasmine standing on the porch, her phone still in hand. The moment he stepped out of the car, she walked down to meet him, her expression unreadable. Come inside, she said simply. Daniel followed her in, shutting the door behind him. Emily was asleep on the couch, curled up under a thick blanket. Even in sleep, her brow was furrowed, her small hands clenched. His gut twisted at the sight, but he pushed it aside. He would give her peace again, no matter what it took. Jasmine led him into the kitchen, where her laptop sat open on the table. A grainy, enhanced image was displayed on the screen. Daniel stepped closer, his pulse steady, but his focus sharpening. The figure sitting in the SUV next to Calloway was clearer now, short dark hair, a heavy-set build, and a badge clipped to his belt. That's Sergeant Harold Boone, Jasmine said, her voice tight. Internal Affairs. Daniel's eyes darkened. Internal Affairs. The same department that's supposed to investigate cops like Calloway. Jasmine nodded. Exactly. Which means if Boone was involved, this thing goes even deeper than we thought. He's the one making sure the complaints against them disappear. He's the reason they've never faced consequences. Daniel exhaled slowly, staring at the screen. He's the gatekeeper. The one pulling the strings from the inside. And the one we need to take down, Jasmine added. Daniel tapped his fingers against the edge of the table. We need to move carefully. If he realizes we're onto him, he'll shut everything down before we can get real proof. Jasmine leaned back in her chair. So, what's the plan? Daniel's expression hardened. We shake the tree and see what falls out. Jasmine sighed, rubbing her temples. All right, but we need leverage. If Boone's been covering for them, there has to be a trail. We need to find something that ties him directly to Calloway and Miller's misconduct. Daniel nodded. I'll pay him a visit. See if he reacts. If he's nervous, we'll know we're close. Meanwhile, you dig through whatever records you can find. Bank transactions, internal memos, anything that smells like a cover-up. Jasmine hesitated. Daniel, you confronting him could tip him off. If he knows you're sniffing around, then he'll make a mistake. Daniel cut in. And I'll be watching. She studied him for a long moment, then exhaled. Fine, but be careful. Boone isn't just some street thug. He's got influence. Daniel stood, already reaching for his keys. So do I. The Internal Affairs Office was located in a separate wing of the police department, a quieter, more insulated space designed to keep investigations discreet. Daniel walked in, his steps slow, deliberate. The receptionist barely glanced up before gesturing toward a door at the end of the hall. Sergeant Boone's office. Daniel knocked once before pushing the door open. Boone sat behind a cluttered desk, flipping through paperwork. He was exactly as the photo had shown. Broad shoulders, a thick neck, and an expression that oozed self-importance. Boone looked up, mildly surprised. Can I help you? Daniel shut the door behind him. You can start by telling me why you were sitting in an SUV with Calloway minutes before my daughter was detained. A flicker of recognition passed through Boone's eyes before he leaned back in his chair. I don't know what you're talking about. Daniel slid a printed copy of the enhanced image onto Boone's desk. That's you, isn't it? Boone stared at the image, his expression unreadable. Then he chuckled, shaking his head. This is what you came in here for, a blurry photo. You think you can walk in here, throw accusations around, and get answers. Daniel remained silent, letting the weight of his presence do the talking. Boone's smirk faded slightly. Listen, Carter, I know your background. I know who you are. And I know you think you're some kind of warrior, out to fix the world. But you're out of your league. This isn't some battlefield where you can kick down doors and take names. Daniel tilted his head. Funny, because that's exactly what I plan on doing. Boone's fingers drummed against the desk. You need to walk away from this. Whatever you think you know, whatever you think you're going to prove, it won't change a damn thing. Daniel leaned forward, his voice low. I don't walk away, and I don't stop. A tense silence filled the room. Boone's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Daniel straightened. I'll be seeing you, Sergeant. He turned and walked out, feeling Boone's eyes on his back the entire way. As he stepped into the hall, his phone buzzed. It was Jasmine. You were right, she said. I found something. Meet me at home. Daniel didn't ask questions. He just walked faster. War had just begun. Daniel barely slowed as he pulled into the driveway. The engine had hardly shut off before he was out of the car, striding toward the front door. Jasmine was already waiting, the screen door swinging open as he stepped inside. What did you find? He asked, skipping any pretense of small talk. Jasmine motioned toward the kitchen table, where her laptop was open beside a stack of printed documents. I found a financial trail. Boone has been making deposits into an offshore account for years, large sums, way beyond his salary. Someone's been paying him to keep things quiet. Daniel scanned the numbers on the screen, his mind working fast. Who's funding him? Jasmine clicked to another tab. That's where it gets interesting. The deposits come from multiple shell companies, all routed through different banks. But one name kept popping up in my search, Horizon Tactical Solutions. It's a private security firm. Daniel frowned. Never heard of them. You wouldn't have, Jasmine said. They specialize in police and military contracts, training, equipment, off-the-books operations. And guess who they've done extensive business with? The Austin Police Department, specifically units connected to Boone. Daniel's pulse remained steady, but his grip on the chair tightened. So Boone isn't just covering up for Calloway and Miller. He's part of something bigger. Jasmine nodded. And it's not all. I found reports linking Horizon Tactical to incidents across multiple states, cases just like Emily's, unprovoked stops, escalations, missing evidence. Every time someone in internal affairs buried the complaints. This isn't just about Austin, Daniel. It's a network. Daniel exhaled slowly. He had expected corruption, but this? This was an organized operation, and if Boone was part of it, that meant others were too. We need proof, he said, more to himself than to Jasmine. Something solid that exposes Horizon Tactical and its connection to Boone. Jasmine leaned forward. I might have a lead. Boone has a storage unit, registered under his wife's name. It's in a private facility outside city limits. If he's keeping anything off the record, it's there. Daniel was already standing. Then that's our next move. Jasmine reached out, catching his wrist. You can't go in blind. If Boone suspects we're onto him, he'll wipe everything. You need a plan. Daniel met her gaze, his voice firm. I always have a plan. The storage facility was a quiet, isolated compound on the outskirts of town. Rows of identical metal units stretched into the distance, each one secured with reinforced locks and surveillance cameras positioned at key points. Daniel parked a block away, surveying the area through binoculars. Boone's unit was near the back, away from the main entrance. Less visibility. Fewer security patrols. It was exactly the kind of location someone would choose if they wanted to hide something. Daniel adjusted his jacket, checking the slim toolkit concealed inside. He moved swiftly across the lot, sticking to the blind spots between security cameras. Within minutes, he was at Boone's unit. The lock was high-end, but not unbreakable. Daniel worked quickly, his hand steady, and within 30 seconds the latch clicked open. He slipped inside, shutting the door behind him. The air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and aged paper. Shelves lined the walls, filled with boxes, old equipment, and several locked file cabinets. Daniel pulled on gloves before moving toward the nearest box. Inside he found stacks of police reports, cases dating back years. Many of them were marked closed in bold red ink. He flipped through them, recognizing names, victims of police misconduct, complaints that had disappeared, families who had never seen justice. His stomach twisted, but he forced himself to focus. He moved to the next shelf, rifling through folders. Then he found it. A thick binder labeled Horizon Tactical, Project Ironclad. Daniel opened it, scanning the pages. Inside were contracts, payment records, and most damning emails. Correspondence between Boone senior officers and executives from Horizon Tactical, detailing strategic operations designed to escalate police encounters and justify increased funding for militarized training programs. It was all there. Proof of systemic abuse. Proof that Boone wasn't just covering up misconduct. He was helping orchestrate it. Daniel pulled out his phone, snapping photos of every document. He didn't have time to take the whole binder, but he could take enough to blow the case open. Then he heard it. The crunch of tires outside. Someone was here. Daniel moved fast, snapping the binder shut and tucking it back where he found it. He slid behind a metal shelf, pressing himself into the shadows as a car door slammed outside. Through the thin slats of the storage unit's door, he saw a figure approaching. The man was stocky, wearing a dark jacket and moving with purpose. Boone. Daniel's mind raced. If Boone was here, it meant he had reason to suspect someone might be looking. That meant he had to act fast. Boone reached the unit and pulled out a key, fitting it into the lock. The second he stepped inside, Daniel struck. A swift, controlled movement, one hand clamping over Boone's mouth, the other twisting his arm behind his back, forcing him against the metal shelving. Boone struggled, but Daniel leaned in, voice a quiet growl. "Make a sound, and I break your arm. Nod if you understand." Boone stilled, then nodded. Daniel eased his grip just enough to let him breathe. "How long have you been working for Horizon Tactical?" "How deep does this go?" Boone let out a strained chuckle. "You think you scare me? You have no idea what you're up against." Daniel applied pressure to Boone's wrist, making him wince. "Try me." Boone's face twisted in pain, but he didn't break. "You're wasting your time, Carter. Even if you take me down, there's 10 more just like me. This doesn't stop with me." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Then I'll take down all 10. Boone smirked despite the pain. "You really don't get it, do you? You're poking a bear you can't kill. Horizon doesn't just own a few cops. They own the system. The courts, the politicians. You think one ex-soldier is going to change that?" Daniel didn't respond. He was already planning his next move. But before he could act, Boone's phone buzzed in his pocket. A name flashed on the screen. Unknown caller. Boone's smirk widened. Too late. They know. Daniel's grip tightened. Outside, another car pulled up. Then another. Backup had arrived. Daniel's muscles coiled as the sound of approaching vehicles filled the air. He released Boone and stepped back, mind calculating his next move. Boone straightened, rubbing his wrist with a smug grin. "You should have stayed out of this, Carter," Boone taunted, his voice low but laced with triumph. "Now you're stuck." Daniel didn't flinch. He assessed the room. No back exits, just the large metal door leading outside. Fighting his way out wasn't an option, not with multiple hostiles converging. He needed to think fast. Footsteps crunched outside. Daniel counted at least 4, maybe more. They weren't rushing, which meant they believed they had the upper hand. "Last chance, Carter," Boone said, stretching his shoulders. "Walk away, and I pretend this never happened." Daniel gave a small, humorless chuckle. "That's not happening." Boone sighed. "Didn't think so." With a sharp nod, he stepped toward the door, reaching for the handle. At the same time, Daniel moved. He kicked a shelf, sending a cascade of boxes tumbling down, crashing against Boone's side. Boone staggered, cursing, as Daniel used the distraction to dart behind a heavier storage cabinet. The door flew open. Men stormed in, tactical gear visible beneath their jackets. Their weapons remained holstered for now, but their hands hovered near their belts. "Boone!" one of them called. Boone groaned, shoving a box off his leg. "I'm fine. Carter's here." The leader, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair, scanned the unit before locking eyes on Daniel's hiding spot. "Step out. Hands where I can see them." Daniel didn't move. He analyzed their positioning, noting their angles and sight lines. He could take 2 down before the others reacted, but then what? He needed another way. The leader's patience wore thin. "Carter, I won't ask again." Daniel exhaled slowly, then stepped out, hands raised slightly but relaxed. "I assume you're with Horizon Tactical." The man smirked. Good guess. You must be pretty desperate if you're sending this many guys for one man. Not desperate, just cautious. The leader's gaze flicked to Boone. He have anything on him? Boone, still dusting himself off, scowled. Just his phone. But he took pictures. The leader turned back to Daniel. Hand it over. Daniel glanced at his pocket, then at the men before him. And if I don't? The leader's smirk disappeared. Then we take it. And you don't leave this place in one piece. Daniel weighed his options. Then, with an almost casual movement, he pulled out his phone and tossed it to the leader. The man caught it, then turned to Boone. Delete the files. Make sure there's nothing left. Boone grabbed the phone, fingers flying across the screen. After a few moments, he looked up with a satisfied nod. It's done? The leader smirked. See? That wasn't so hard. Daniel remained expressionless. You sure about that? Boone frowned, then glanced back at the phone. His face paled. Wait. Too late. A faint chime echoed from one of the boxes nearby. Then another. And another. The leader's head snapped up. What the hell? Daniel moved. In one swift motion, he kicked a loose shelf, knocking a stack of metal cases into the nearest man. At the same time, he lunged forward, driving his shoulder into Boone's chest and sending him crashing to the ground. Chaos erupted. One of the armed men reached for his gun, but Daniel was faster. He twisted, grabbing the man's wrist and slamming it against a nearby crate. The gun clattered to the floor. The leader barked orders. Take him down. Daniel ducked, weaving through the confined space. He grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight from a shelf and swung it in a brutal arc, catching another man across the jaw. He crumpled instantly. Boone scrambled backward, gasping. Shoot him! A shot rang out. Daniel spun, narrowly avoiding the bullet as it punched into a metal cabinet. He grabbed the downed man's weapon and fired back. Not to kill, but to disarm. The shot clipped the last attacker's shoulder, sending his gun skidding across the floor. The leader snarled. Enough! A sharp whistle pierced the air. Daniel paused, his grip on the weapon firm. The leader held up a hand, signaling his men to stand down. You made your point, Carter. The leader exhaled, rolling his shoulders. But this doesn't change anything. We'll come for you again. And next time, you won't be this lucky. Daniel stepped over Boone, his gaze cold. You should have killed me when you had the chance. Boone shuddered, but said nothing. The leader tilted his head, studying Daniel with something almost like respect. We'll see how long that confidence lasts. Daniel didn't wait for more threats. He turned and walked out, disappearing into the night. The drive back was quiet, tension still thick in the air. Daniel's hands were steady on the wheel, but his mind raced. They had taken his phone, wiped the files. But what they didn't realize was that Daniel had planned for this. Jasmine was already waiting when he arrived. You okay? Daniel nodded. They took my phone, erased everything. Jasmine's lips pressed into a thin line. Did you? I backed it up before I left. The files are safe. She exhaled, relieved. Good, because we're running out of time. Horizon Tactical knows we're onto them. We need to move fast. Daniel looked past her toward the small, sleeping form on the couch. Emily. The reason he was doing this. His expression hardened. Then we take the fight to them. The night was still, but Daniel's mind was anything but. He sat in Jasmine's dimly lit kitchen, his hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee that had long gone cold. His thoughts raced through the events of the past 24 hours. The fight at the storage unit, the revelation about Horizon Tactical, the cold promise of retaliation from Boone's men. It was all spiraling faster than even he had anticipated. Jasmine sat across from him, her fingers tapping a restless rhythm against the table. "We need to make a move before they do," she said. "Horizon Tactical won't wait around for us to gather more evidence. They'll try to shut us down first." Daniel nodded. "We need more than just files and names. We need a witness. Someone from the inside who can confirm what we already know." Jasmine's eyes flickered with thought. "I might have someone, but it's risky." Daniel leaned forward. "Who?" She hesitated. "There's an officer, Thomas Parker. He's young, ambitious, and more importantly, he hates what Boone and his people are doing. I've spoken to him before. He's careful, but I think he might be willing to talk." Daniel considered it. "Can you set up a meeting?" Jasmine exhaled slowly. "I can try. But if he says no, we're back to square one. Then don't give him the option to say no." Daniel's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "Make him understand what's at stake." The meeting was set for midnight at a rundown diner on the outskirts of the city. Daniel and Jasmine arrived first, sitting in a booth near the back, away from prying eyes. The place smelled of burnt coffee and fried food, and the neon sign outside flickered weakly against the darkness. Parker walked in 5 minutes later, his posture tense, his eyes scanning the room before he spotted them. He hesitated, then walked over, sliding into the booth across from them. "This better be good," he muttered, glancing around nervously. "If Boone finds out, I'm here." "Then we're both dead," Daniel interrupted. "So let's cut to the chase. How deep are you in this?" Parker's jaw tightened. "I'm not in anything. I've seen things. Things that don't add up." Jasmine leaned in. "Like what?" Parker sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Like Horizon Tactical getting contracts they shouldn't have. Like evidence disappearing when it implicates certain officers. Like Boone giving orders that don't come from anywhere official." Daniel studied him. "Why haven't you reported it?" Parker gave a bitter laugh. "To who? Boone? The chief? You think they don't already know? The system protects its own." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then it's time to break the system. And you're going to help us do it." Parker's eyes widened. "You're crazy. Even if I wanted to, I have no proof. Just suspicions." Jasmine pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. "We have more than suspicions. We have financial records, hidden contracts, and a direct link between Boone and Horizon Tactical." Parker hesitated before opening the folder. His eyes scanned the pages, his expression darkening. "Where did you get this?" Daniel didn't answer. "What matters is, will you help us?" Parker swallowed hard. "If I do this, there's no coming back." Daniel's gaze was steady. There was never going to be. Parker let out a slow breath, running a hand over his face. "All right, what do you need from me?" Jasmine leaned forward. "We need records, communications, anything that directly links Boone and Horizon Tactical to illegal activity." Parker shook his head. "That's easier said than done. Boone's careful. He doesn't put much in writing, but there might be something." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "Go on." Parker hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Boone meets with Horizon Tactical representatives once a month. They don't do it at the precinct. They use a private location off the books. Only a handful of people know about it." Jasmine exchanged a look with Daniel. Where? Parker swallowed. An old warehouse near the docks. Next meeting is in 2 days. Daniel's mind was already working. Surveillance? Security? Minimal, Parker said. They don't think anyone's watching. They feel untouchable? That's their first mistake, Daniel murmured. He glanced at Jasmine. We need to be there. Jasmine nodded. We'll need gear. A way in and out. Parker held up a hand. Wait, if you get caught. We won't, Daniel said simply. But if we do, we'll make sure Boone is taken down with us. Parker exhaled, nodding. I'll get you the details, but after this, I'm out. Daniel didn't respond. He already knew that wasn't true. 2 nights later, Daniel crouched behind a stack of shipping containers near the warehouse. The docks were quiet, the sound of waves slapping against the pier the only noise in the night. Jasmine was beside him, her expression tight with focus. Through the small gaps between the containers, they could see a few cars parked near the entrance. A handful of men loitered outside, smoking and talking. Daniel checked his watch. They should be inside by now. Jasmine nodded, adjusting the small camera clipped to her jacket. Ready when you are. Daniel exhaled slowly, then moved. They slipped through the shadows, staying low. The side door was their best entry point. Unlocked, according to Parker. He had come through. Daniel reached the door and tested the handle. It gave way. He exchanged a glance with Jasmine before easing it open, stepping inside. The warehouse was dimly lit, the air thick with a scent of oil and dust. Voices echoed from the other side of the space. Daniel signaled to Jasmine, and they moved toward the source of the voices. They reached a stack of crates and peered through a gap. Inside, Boone stood with 2 men in suits, Horizon tactical operatives. We need to move faster, one of them said. Carter is becoming a problem. Boone's face darkened. He's not just a problem, he's a threat. And threats get eliminated. Daniel's grip tightened. Jasmine barely breathed. We need to record this. Daniel nodded, raising a small recording device. But before he could start, a floorboard creaked beneath them. One of the men snapped his head toward their hiding spot. Did you hear that? Daniel tensed. Then all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted. Daniel grabbed Jasmine and yanked her behind a stack of crates just as bullets tore through the air, splintering wood and ricocheting off metal. The warehouse filled with the deafening sound of gunfire and shouting as Boone's men scrambled into action. Move! Daniel hissed, pushing Jasmine toward the far end of the warehouse. She stayed low, clutching the small recording device in her hand like a lifeline. From the other side of the room, Boone's voice rang out. Find them! Now! Footsteps thundered across the concrete as armed men spread out, weapons raised, eyes scanning the dimly lit space. Daniel and Jasmine weaved between stacks of cargo using the darkness to their advantage. We're pinned, Jasmine whispered. They've got the exits covered. Daniel's mind worked quickly. We create a new exit. He spotted a ladder leading up to the rafters. If they could get to the roof, they'd have a better chance. Go, he ordered, boosting Jasmine up. She scrambled onto the first rung, climbing fast. Daniel followed, but just as he reached for the ladder, a flashlight beam swept over him. There! A guard shouted. Daniel spun, grabbing a wooden pallet and hurling it toward the man. The makeshift weapon crashed into the guard, sending him sprawling. Before he could recover, Daniel landed a brutal kick to his ribs, knocking him unconscious. Jasmine reached the rafters, gripping the steel beams above. Daniel! She called urgently. More guards stormed into view. No time to hesitate. Daniel jumped, grabbing Jasmine's outstretched hand as she pulled him up. Below, Boone's men fired, bullets whizzing past them. "Roof access?" Daniel asked. Jasmine pointed. "There!" They rushed across the beams, balancing precariously above the chaos. A rusted skylight loomed ahead. Without slowing, Daniel swung his elbow into the glass, shattering it. He climbed through first, then helped Jasmine up. The cold night air hit them as they emerged onto the rooftop. Below, sirens blared. Parker had done his part. "They're coming," Jasmine said breathlessly. "We need to move." Daniel spotted a fire escape leading down the side of the building. Just as they reached it, the door behind them burst open. Boone stepped out, gun in hand. "You're a dead man, Carter," Boone growled. Daniel didn't hesitate. He lunged, slamming Boone's arm against the metal railing. The gun fired, the shot going wide. Boone swung wildly, but Daniel ducked and drove his fist into Boone's gut. Boone staggered, but he wasn't done. He lunged again, tackling Daniel against the edge of the roof. Jasmine stepped forward, but Boone snarled, "Stay back, or he dies!" Daniel gritted his teeth. "You don't have the guts!" Boone's grip tightened. Then, in one swift move, Daniel twisted free, using Boone's momentum against him. Boone lost his footing. His eyes widened in panic as he slipped over the edge. He caught the railing at the last second, dangling above the alleyway below. "Help me!" he gasped. Daniel stared down at him, breathing hard. Jasmine moved beside him. "We need him alive. He's proof." Daniel's jaw clenched. Then reluctantly, he reached down and grabbed Boone's wrist. "Don't make me regret this," he muttered, hauling him up just as police cars skidded to a stop below. Boone collapsed onto the rooftop, gasping for breath, his face a mix of shock and fury. Below, the flashing red and blue lights of police vehicles illuminated the alley, officers rushing out, weapons drawn. Jasmine took out her phone, pressing a few buttons before nodding. "I sent the recordings to multiple sources, news outlets, the FBI, even the mayor's office. The whole city will know what Horizon Tactical has been doing." Daniel hauled Boone to his feet, twisting his arm behind his back just as officers burst onto the rooftop. The lead officer, a tall woman with sharp eyes, took in the scene quickly. "Daniel Carter?" He nodded, shoving Boone toward them. "This man is involved in a massive conspiracy, covering for dirty cops and funding illegal operations." The officer gestured for her men to take Boone. As they slapped cuffs on him, Boone sneered. "You think this ends with me? You think Horizon Tactical just rolls over?" Daniel's expression remained cold. "Number, but you won't be around to see what happens next." The officer nodded to Daniel and Jasmine. "We'll need your statements." Jasmine exhaled. "You'll have them." As Boone was dragged away, Daniel turned to the city skyline, his fists still clenched. It wasn't over yet, but they had won this battle. For now. Gunfire erupted. Daniel grabbed Jasmine and yanked her behind a stack of crates just as bullets tore through the air, splintering wood and ricocheting off metal. The warehouse filled with the deafening sound of gunfire and shouting as Boone's men scrambled into action. "Move!" Daniel hissed, pushing Jasmine toward the far end of the warehouse. She stayed low, clutching the small recording device in her hand like a lifeline. From the other side of the room, Boone's voice rang out. "Find them! Now!" Footsteps thundered across the concrete as armed men spread out, weapons raised, eyes scanning the dimly lit space. Daniel and Jasmine weaved between stacks of cargo, using the darkness to their advantage. "We're pinned," Jasmine whispered. "They've got the exits covered." Daniel's mind worked quickly. "We create a new exit." He spotted a ladder leading up to the rafters. If they could get to the roof, they'd have a better chance. "Go," he ordered, boosting Jasmine up. She scrambled onto the first rung, climbing fast. Daniel followed, but just as he reached for the ladder, a flashlight beam swept over him. "There!" a guard shouted. Daniel spun, grabbing a wooden pallet and hurling it toward the man. The makeshift weapon crashed into the guard, sending him sprawling. Before he could recover, Daniel landed a brutal kick to his ribs, knocking him unconscious. Jasmine reached the rafters, gripping the steel beams above. "Daniel!" she called urgently. More guards stormed into view. No time to hesitate. Daniel jumped, grabbing Jasmine's outstretched hand as she pulled him up. Below, Boone's men fired, bullets whizzing past them. "Roof access?" Daniel asked. Jasmine pointed. "There!" They rushed across the beams, balancing precariously above the chaos. A rusted skylight loomed ahead. Without slowing, Daniel swung his elbow into the glass, shattering it. He climbed through first, then helped Jasmine up. The cold night air hit them as they emerged onto the rooftop. Below, sirens blared. Parker had done his part. "They're coming," Jasmine said breathlessly. "We need to move." Daniel spotted a fire escape leading down the side of the building. Just as they reached it, the door behind them burst open. Boone stepped out, gun in hand. "You're a dead man, Carter," Boone growled. Daniel didn't hesitate. He lunged, slamming Boone's arm against the metal railing. The gun fired, the shot going wide. Boone swung wildly, but Daniel ducked and drove his fist into Boone's gut. Boone staggered, but he wasn't done. He lunged again, tackling Daniel against the edge of the roof. Jasmine stepped forward, but Boone snarled, "Stay back, or he dies!" Daniel gritted his teeth. "You don't have the guts!" Boone's grip tightened. Then in one swift move, Daniel twisted free, using Boone's momentum against him. Boone lost his footing. His eyes widened in panic as he slipped over the edge. He caught the railing at the last second, dangling above the alleyway below. "Help me!" he gasped. Daniel stared down at him, breathing hard. Jasmine moved beside him. "We need him alive. He's proof." Daniel's jaw clenched. Then reluctantly he reached down and grabbed Boone's wrist. "Don't make me regret this," he muttered, hauling him up just as police cars skidded to a stop below. Boone collapsed onto the rooftop, gasping for breath, his face a mix of shock and fury. Below, the flashing red and blue lights of police vehicles illuminated the alley, officers rushing out, weapons drawn. Jasmine took out her phone, pressing a few buttons before nodding. "I sent the recordings to multiple sources, news outlets, the FBI, even the mayor's office. The whole city will know what Horizon Tactical has been doing." Daniel hauled Boone to his feet, twisting his arm behind his back just as officers burst onto the rooftop. The lead officer, a tall woman with sharp eyes, took in the scene quickly. "Daniel Carter." He nodded, shoving Boone toward them. "This man is involved in a massive conspiracy, covering for dirty cops and funding illegal operations." The officer gestured for her men to take Boone. As they slapped cuffs on him, Boone sneered. "You think this ends with me? You think Horizon Tactical just rolls over?" Daniel's expression remained cold. "Number, but you won't be around to see what happens next." The officer nodded to Daniel and Jasmine. "We'll need your statements." Jasmine exhaled. "You'll have them." As Boone was dragged away, Daniel turned to the city skyline, his fists still clenched. It wasn't over yet, but they had won this battle. For now. The interrogation room was cold, sterile. Boone sat across the table, wrists cuffed, his expression blank but his eyes burning with resentment. Across from him, Daniel and Jasmine sat with the lead investigator, Special Agent Rowe from the FBI. Rowe placed a folder on the table. "We have enough to put you away for a long time, Boone." Boone leaned back, smirking. "That's so?" Daniel spoke before Rowe could. "It is. But you're just the middleman. We want the people above you." Boone's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jasmine slid a document toward him. "We traced payments from Horizon Tactical to multiple high-ranking officials. You were their enforcer, but the real power sits above you." Boone's fingers twitched. He was starting to crack. Rowe folded his arms. "You talk now, and we consider a deal. You keep your mouth shut. You take the fall alone." Boone exhaled sharply, staring at the document in front of him. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. Daniel leaned in. "This is your only chance." Silence stretched. Then finally Boone nodded. "I want protection," he said, "and in exchange, I'll tell you everything." Gunfire erupted. Daniel grabbed Jasmine and yanked her behind a stack of crates just as bullets tore through the air, splintering wood and ricocheting off metal. The warehouse filled with the deafening sound of gunfire and shouting as Boone's men scrambled into action. "Move!" Daniel hissed, pushing Jasmine toward the far end of the warehouse. She stayed low, clutching the small recording device in her hand like a lifeline. From the other side of the room, Boone's voice rang out. "Find 'em! Now!" Footsteps thundered across the concrete as armed men spread out, weapons raised, eyes scanning the dimly lit space. Daniel and Jasmine weaved between stacks of cargo, using the darkness to their advantage. "We're pinned," Jasmine whispered. "They've got the exits covered." Daniel's mind worked quickly. "We create a new exit." He spotted a ladder leading up to the rafters. If they could get to the roof, they'd have a better chance. "Go!" he ordered, boosting Jasmine up. She scrambled onto the first rung, climbing fast. Daniel followed, but just as he reached for the ladder, a flashlight beam swept over him. "There!" a guard shouted. Daniel spun, grabbing a wooden pallet and hurling it toward the man. The makeshift weapon crashed into the guard, sending him sprawling. Before he could recover, Daniel landed a brutal kick to his ribs, knocking him unconscious. Jasmine reached the rafters, gripping the steel beams above. "Daniel!" she called urgently. More guards stormed into view. No time to hesitate. Daniel jumped, grabbing Jasmine's outstretched hand as she pulled him up. Below, Boone's men fired, bullets whizzing past them. "Roof access?" Daniel asked. Jasmine pointed. "There." They rushed across the beams, balancing precariously above the chaos. A rusted skylight loomed ahead. Without slowing, Daniel swung his elbow into the glass, shattering it. He climbed through first, then helped Jasmine up. The cold night air hit them as they emerged onto the rooftop. Below, sirens blared. Parker had done his part. "They're coming," Jasmine said breathlessly. "We need to move." Daniel spotted a fire escape leading down the side of the building. Just as they reached it, the door behind them burst open. Boone stepped out, gun in hand. "You're a dead man, Carter," Boone growled. Daniel didn't hesitate. He lunged, slamming Boone's arm against the metal railing. The gun fired, the shot going wide. Boone swung wildly, but Daniel ducked and drove his fist into Boone's gut. Boone staggered, but he wasn't done. He lunged again, tackling Daniel against the edge of the roof. Jasmine stepped forward, but Boone snarled, "Stay back, or he dies." Daniel gritted his teeth. "You don't have the guts." Boone's grip tightened. Then in one swift move, Daniel twisted free, using Boone's momentum against him. Boone lost his footing. His eyes widened in panic as he slipped over the edge. He caught the railing at the last second, dangling above the alleyway below. "Help me!" he gasped. Daniel stared down at him, breathing hard. Jasmine moved beside him. "We need him alive. He's proof." Daniel's jaw clenched. Then reluctantly, he reached down and grabbed Boone's wrist. "Don't make me regret this," he muttered, hauling him up just as police cars skidded to a stop below. Boone collapsed onto the rooftop, gasping for breath, his face a mix of shock and fury. Below, the flashing red and blue lights of police vehicles illuminated the alley, officers rushing out, weapons drawn. Jasmine took out her phone, pressing a few buttons before nodding. "I sent the recordings to multiple sources, news outlets, the FBI, even the mayor's office. The whole city will know what Horizon Tactical has been doing." Daniel hauled Boone to his feet, twisting his arm behind his back just as officers burst onto the rooftop. The lead officer, a tall woman with sharp eyes, took in the scene quickly. "Daniel Carter." He nodded, shoving Boone toward them. "This man is involved in a massive conspiracy covering for dirty cops and funding illegal operations." The officer gestured for her men to take Boone. As they slapped cuffs on him, Boone sneered. "You think this ends with me? You think Horizon Tactical just rolls over?" Daniel's expression remained cold. "Number. But you won't be around to see what happens next." The officer nodded to Daniel and Jasmine. "We'll need your statements." Jasmine exhaled. "You'll have them." As Boone was dragged away, Daniel turned to the city skyline, his fists still clenched. It wasn't over yet. But they had won this battle, for now. The interrogation room was cold, sterile. Boone sat across the table, wrist cuffed, his expression blank but his eyes burning with resentment. Across from him, Daniel and Jasmine sat with the lead investigator, Special Agent Rowe from the FBI. Rowe placed a folder on the table. "We have enough to put you away for a long time, Boone." Boone leaned back, smirking. "That so?" Daniel spoke before Rowe could. "It is. But you're just the middleman. We want the people above you." Boone's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jasmine slid a document toward him. "We traced payments from Horizon Tactical to multiple high-ranking officials. You were their enforcer, but the real power sits above you." Boone's fingers twitched. He was starting to crack. Rowe folded his arms. "You talk now, and we consider a deal. You keep your mouth shut. You take the fall alone." Boone exhaled sharply, staring at the document in front of him. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. Daniel leaned in. "This is your only chance." Silence stretched. Then finally Boone nodded. "I want protection," he said. "And in exchange I'll tell you everything." 2 weeks later, Daniel stood on the porch of his home, watching the sun set over the Austin skyline. The fallout had been swift. Boone's testimony led to multiple arrests, corrupt officials, high-ranking officers, and even executives within Horizon Tactical. The organization had been crippled, though Daniel knew better than to think it was gone for good. Jasmine stepped outside, handing him a glass of whiskey. "You did it." He took a slow sip. "We did it." Inside, Emily played with a rescued puppy, laughter filling the air. A sound Daniel hadn't heard in too long. Jasmine smiled. So what now? Daniel exhaled, his shoulders finally relaxing. Now, we live. I hope you enjoyed this story. Subscribe to my channel so you don't miss touching stories. Leave a like and then comment below what you thought of the emotional stories. See you in the next video.